Good morning. Good to see you guys. I want to invite you to open a Bible with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. That's where we are today as we come to the end of this short series we began this fall. We've been hearing about how when Jesus saves us, when we get redeemed by God, the language that's often used is this redemption, this ransom language, that he didn't just save you and kind of wash you and send you on your merry way, but the way the Bible talks about our salvation is that Jesus saves us and then brings us to himself, that we belong to him. And the price that he paid to make that possible was his very life. And so we've been purchased by the blood of Jesus. He's rescued us. And the great promise is that when he has come into this world to save us, he takes all the things in our lives that we've made huge messes of, all these places of brokenness and difficulty, what the Bible would refer to as ashes, which is a picture of something that was once good that has been destroyed. And he takes those ashes and he goes, let me buy that, and I'm going to give you beauty for those ashes. Right? This is the great picture in the Bible that we have of our redemption. And so we must realize that Jesus comes, and he comes to redeem every area of our life, even the difficult places, even the places that feel like unsalvageable to us. Jesus comes along and he goes, I can work with that. I can do something with that. Right? And so this is what we've been looking at, and we've looked at how he's bringing about this redemption and this beauty, even in areas of like conflict that we have in our relationships. We looked at how he does this with our own bodies, how our bodies are his temple, and we've misused our bodies. We have a lot of shame and a lot of guilt around the ways that we've used our bodies, especially in the area of our sexuality. And then 2 weeks ago, we looked at our marriage. If you're in a marriage with somebody, marriages can be a wonderful thing, but they can also be really difficult. And so we see how even in the midst of difficult marriages, God is there with us, and there is hope. And today we come to the final and pretty complex topic of singleness. This is a complex topic to address this morning, and for many reasons. Number one, I'm not single, okay? So I recognize that I'm not up here saying, hey guys, let me tell you about my life, But secondly, I'd say this topic has become very near and dear to my heart in the Bible. Mainly because years ago, as many of you know, my wife and I, we planted a church in Corvallis, Oregon, reaching Oregon State students, and that church grew. And so I pastored a church that was made up of 70% of people who were single. And that kind of rocked me a little bit as a pastor, because you kind of have to learn how to preach differently, and how do you pastor people who are in that stage of life. And it wasn't just college students. It was many people who were further along in their life who were single. And we became this community for one another that was really beautiful. But to also be real with you, honestly, there are many people in my life who I'm very close to who are single. And they're not like, I'm 18 and I'm single. Like if you're 18, you're like, I'm single. It's like, you're fine. You're 18. But people in my life who are much further along in life and they're still single and they don't want to be. And that breaks my heart, as I love them and walk with them, and I've cried many tears on their behalf if they've had really difficult days, despairing in that. I know there's many of you in this room who once were married and you're now single. You went through a difficult divorce, or maybe you lost the love of your life. They passed away. And now you're dealing with the remnants of the pain of that loss, and you're learning to be single again. That's hard. But this is also, I think, pretty complex to preach, because I'd say many of you today are not single. And so you might be tempted to think, man, if I knew this is what we were talking about, I could have skipped church today. I could have come on a different Sunday. It's not relevant to me. But my hope is that you will see how absolutely this is relevant for you and relevant for our church and how we function together as a family. So we're turning our attention in 1 Corinthians to chapter 7, and we're going to read as we go. And if you look at your sermon outline, I'm going to do you a favor and let you know that if you see number 4 on there with a fill in the blank, we're not even going to address it. We're just going to cross it out. There's no number 4 today, so breathe a great sigh of relief, right? That's my gift to you on this Sunday. So we're not having a number 4. There's just the 3 points. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we're going to walk through this and read as we go, and it's going to be a little bit out of order, but I hope somehow this will be helpful to you. The first thing that we see about this area of singleness is that singleness is a gift. What we see is that in this passage, we learn the gift of singleness. So read with me beginning in verse 7 to 8, and then we're going to jump to the end of the chapter to see this. What does it say in verse 7? Paul writes, I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. And then down in verse 36, if anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly towards his fiancée, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes, let them marry. It's no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed, his fiancée, does well. And he who refrains from marriage will do even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she's free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord, meaning they need to be another Christian. Yet, in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So when you begin with, let's start with these verses, verse 36 to 40, and just point out what I would say are surprising statements by Paul. He states that marriage is not bad, right? It's not wrong. It's not settling. It's not failing, right? We saw 2 weeks ago that marriage is a gift, right? It's God created it. He invented the sacred institution of marriage. Marriage is an amazing thing, right? Verse 36, he says it's no sin to marry, right? But he is correcting the view that people have on singleness. He's saying that's all good, right? But notice how he talks about singleness. Verse 38, what does he say? You do well if you marry, but you will do even better if you refrain. Verse 40, he says the person who is widowed is happier if she remains single. So his point is marriage is good, singleness is even better, right? This is what he's actually saying. And we're going to look at why he's saying that in just 1 second. But note that he isn't saying marriage is worse. He's not saying, if you're not strong enough, you could be married. He's not saying it's worse. He's just bringing about this good, equalizing correction here in the society and in the church. Right? So, but look specifically at the word he uses back up in verses 7 and 8. It's even stronger. What does he say? What does he say about singleness? What is it? He says it is a gift. Right? Notice he says each has his own gift from God. What's his gift from God? It's what he is. He goes in verse 8, it is good to remain single as I am. He's talking about his own singleness. And he sees that as a gift from God. This is literally, it means a gift of grace from God. It's God's free gift. It's his grace to him. Right? This is not often what we think of when we think of singleness. Because what is a gift, right? It's not something you earned. It's not something that you're owed. That would be a right. Right? It's something given to you by someone else. It's now your possession. And the gift here is singleness. I mean, have you ever received a gift from someone and you had to put on a face and say, oh, thank you so much, But deep down you're like, now I have an errand to run, Or I'm going to wait a year and I'm going to turn this into a great white elephant gift, or something like that, right? You've all received a gift and you've been like, this doesn't feel like a gift, right? This feels like something worse. This feels like grief, This feels like a hardship. This feels like a burden, Sometimes that's how gifts might feel. And we get this, right? Something that's not perceived as a gift but it's something that processed as grief. And I think that's probably how we read these words, especially if you're single. It doesn't feel like a gift, does it? But when we read the Bible, we see being single in the Christian worldview is a very viable gift, a real gift. Like, sure, it might not be a gift you had on your wish list since childhood, but it is a gift nonetheless. It's a good grace gift from God. And you guys, this is so radical. This is so radical. I referenced a couple weeks ago Stanley Howeth, who's a professor at Duke University, and he argues that Christianity was the very first religion in the world that held up a single adulthood as a viable way of life. No other worldview had ever even held it up as a viable way of life. All other worldviews made family and the bearing of children an absolute value, and that if you didn't have children, if you didn't have a family, you had no honor in society. All cultures back in Jesus' day, so when Corinthians is even being written in the first century, right? All the cultures back in his day viewed single people as a drag on society. It's actually very sad. Rodney Stark, he's a professor over at Baylor University, I believe. He's a social historian, and he talks about how pagan widows would face great social pressure to remarry. And Caesar Augustus even had widows fined if they failed to marry within 2 years. In the first century, a guy named Rabbi Eleazar said, quote, "Any man who has no wife is no proper man." The Talmud went even further, saying the man who is not married at 20 is living in sin. Right? Don't worry, it's not true if you're 20, right? Okay? But think about that. In contrast to what you're reading here, in contrast, among Christians, widowhood in the early church was highly respected. Right? The church stood ready to sustain widows in the early church, giving them a choice whether they wanted to remarry or not. Single widows were active and honored members in the church. Right? They had the same access to God. See, singleness, according to Christianity, you guys, is not plan B. It's a viable plan A for life. And as a result of this revolutionary attitude, the early church did not pressure people to marry, but they saw singleness as a gift for the cause of Jesus. I mean, how is this so? How is Christianity so revolutionary? Well, think about it. The founder of our faith was single, right? Jesus as a single man, but yet the perfect human being. He wasn't a drag on society. He wasn't lacking. He was completely whole, right? So guys, if all of this is true, then here's the point. Here's the point. We should never think of singleness as second best. We should never think of singleness as second best. If you are here and you are single, you are not less than. You are not lacking. You aren't waiting to be made whole by someone else. I'm serious. Jesus makes you whole. He makes you whole. And if you think another person's going to make you whole, you're going to be very disappointed, and you're going to crush that person with your expectations. And there are so many married people in this room who experience that. We put so many God-like expectations on our spouse to complete us, and that was never what they were designed to do. I mean, if you're married, you know this. Right? If you're married, and especially if you have kids, especially if you have your own immediate family, we must never look at somebody else in this world, especially in the church, with pity. Especially if they don't have pity for themselves and think that all their hopes and all their joys in life are lacking until they can get to the reality of life that you have. Right, so we want to avoid questions even in the church. Not that you would maybe actually say this, but you would never want to walk up to somebody in our church who's single and have this attitude of like, oh, you're still single. Right? I mean, that'd be the spiritual or theological equivalent of them looking at you if you're married and saying, oh, you're still married. Right? Both are viable plan A's in the kingdom of God. It's not second best, but this isn't often how we see it. We don't often see it as a gift. Why? probably, I think, because we often define singleness in negative terms. We tend to define singleness by what it isn't versus by what it is. Right? We don't do this with other things. It's actually really interesting. I mean, I've never been tempted to go up to a gymnast and go, wow, you were so short, like you can't dunk a basketball. That's crazy. No, I go up to them and I would see their floor routine or their uneven bars performance, whatever you'd say, right? And I go, oh my gosh, I can't do that. I mean, it's amazing. Like, look at what you're able to do, right? I don't go up to kids, especially my own kids, and go, man, you guys can't pay bills, you can't get a job, right? You can't go on dates, all this stuff. I go, no, look at the freedom you have. Like, you have little to no cares in this world, right? You just get to be a kid. You're going to play all day, right? And your greatest concern is what you're going to eat, right? I mean, stuff like that. I don't define them by what they can't do. Like, to be even dumber, I don't go up to a chair, go, you're not a bed, beds are better. I don't do that. I don't go up to a tree and go, you're not soft grass, like you're, sticks and stuff, right? I don't do that. I just go, you're majestic, you're amazing, you're beautiful for what you are, right? We don't do this with anything in life, but for whatever reasons, we do this with this area, right? The Bible stands in stark contrast to the world because singleness is defined not for what it lacks, but for the benefits of what it has. And that's what we look at next. Paul outlines just a couple. There could be so many, but he outlines a couple of advantages of singleness. We see the advantages of singleness beginning in verse 32 through 35. He lists out two different kinds of advantages here, which would lead him to say this is a gift, which would lead him to say, verse 37, that they would do well by being single, which would lead him to saying what he says in verse 38, that they would do even better, or they'd be happier. Verse 32 and 35, what does he say? I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried and betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Undivided devotion to the Lord. So there's two advantages, like I said. The first one is in verses 32 to 34, and the advantage of being single, he says, is being free from particular kinds of anxieties. The advantage is you get to be free from particular kinds of anxieties. All right, now let's be really honest up front. There's some horrible thinking done in the name of Christ where men or women, I think it's usually more amongst the men, who become Christians, they become really sold out in their faith, so to speak, or they think they are, and they decide for the sake of devotion to God or to be free from these worldly anxieties that they're going to abandon their families in the name of Jesus. And if that's you or if that's the temptation you feel, please realize God is not telling you to do that. He's not telling you ever to abandon your family. That's not from God. That's honestly messed up. Right? If you're married, you didn't marry the wrong person. Right? And being free from them won't bring honor to God. Paul talks about here that you shouldn't seek divorce in order just to be single or something, especially if you want to cloak it under this idea of being more devoted to God. With that said, our passage says that there are many great blessings in marriage, but there are also difficulties as well. Right? That's what he's pointing out here. And understandably, I think Christian couples don't often talk openly about the hard things that they can face in marriage, which can give single people like a rose-tinted view of marriage. If you're not honest about some of the difficulties or some of the anxieties that you're under as a married family. I mean, just think about that. As a single person, you can look at a married family and you can just think, man, I wish I had that. It's awesome. I often think about how all families, it seems, we all like to go out and get professional or semi-professional family photos taken. If you guys have probably ever done this, my wife always color coordinates all of our outfits, and I just wear what I'm told. And you go out and all this, and you get great photos. They're great, honestly. They're so cute of the kids and all these different things. But what you don't see, and what every family understands, is that behind every smiling face of a kid is like a threatening parent on the other side of that camera, right? The kids look perfect. Oh, what a perfect family, a perfect life. But on the other side of that camera, he's like, if you don't smile right now, right? Or there's promises, right? You'll get ice cream later. There's like this idea. But you can have this presentation like, oh, it's the best. Everything's great. There's no problems, right? But there's a view behind that camera too. And that's kind of what Paul's getting at. We can project the attitude of perfection to unmarried adults, but the reality is every married person in here could testify to different heartaches. And don't get me wrong, there are many healthy and happy marriages too, but there's a downside even when a married couple's relationship is good. Life is just more complicated. There's more than one person to consider in making decisions about how you're going to use your time. If you're going to have somebody over for dinner, right? What are you going to do for the holidays? Are you, what's the daily menu going to be? Are you going to give money to that thing? Right? Are you going to go on that trip? Right? That there's more than one person to worry about. And children bring great joy, but also some anxiety as well, is what he's saying. You could summarize it by saying, he's basically saying, hey, the grass isn't always greener on the other side. Right? So don't buy into that idea. An advantage to the single life is that you're free from many anxieties and responsibilities that marriage and family brings with it. Right? You might feel anxiety with being single, but marriage isn't your solution to your anxiety. It just comes with a different set of anxieties, okay? The second thing he says is the advantage is an undivided devotion to Jesus. That you can have an undivided devotion to Jesus. Notice how in verse 34, he says the married man has interests that are divided, okay? Doesn't mean they're sinful, it just means they're divided. And then verse 35, he says, I say this to what? Secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. So a vital part of the Christian responsibility of married persons is to take care of their spouse, to take care of their children. That should take time, right? Time that cannot therefore be spent sometimes hanging out with non-Christians. Time that can't necessarily be spent hanging out with other believers at any hour of the day or the night. If someone wants me to do something, I don't just get to say, oh, sure, let me do that. I'll say, well, talk to my wife first. You know what I mean? It's just this kind of idea. And so as a single person, you are more freed up to follow Jesus into radical service, whether it's here in Redlands or to an unreached people group, like a deaf people group that we just prayed about this morning even, overseas. You're more free to engage in things like fighting human trafficking or helping other orphans or helping other widows. Free to serve in the local church, leading out and discipling other people, going out and sharing the gospel any night. An advantage to singleness is having more freedom to do these things, is what Paul is saying. And I think we all get this. I remember back when my life was radically changed by Christ in college at CBU. I would volunteer often, like on the weekends, up in Big Bear, California at a Christian camp called Pine Summit. I go up there every weekend and do that. I would go out with friends to like downtown LA, and we go to restaurants just to like try to share the gospel with Muslims and befriend them. I'd work at a summer camp every summer, and I got paid $120 a week. I got free room and board. I thought I was rich, you guys. I was like, I'm great, this is fine. I'd go on mission trips for 5 to 6 weeks to unengaged people groups. I'd go, man, I need a day of rest. Just go out to the mountains or go to the beach or something, or go fishing or read when I wanted, or experience depth of friendship with other guys as we challenge one another to pursue Jesus, right? I'm not saying I wish I had that life or something. Elizabeth would be nervous right now, or right? But what I'm saying is there is great advantages to being single. Right? There's a freedom to pursuing Christ that is undivided in devotion. You see, there are some who consciously choose to stay single, to devote themselves to this work, And Jesus mentions them in Matthew chapter 19. When he teaches on divorce, the disciples respond to Jesus in Matthew 19 saying, man, should anybody get married then? Right? No one should get married. And Jesus has a list here of all these people who are eunuchs or celibates or single people. And the third list of what he says is, he goes, there are some who have made themselves eunuchs, celibates, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this receive it. Most single people haven't chosen singleness in this way. But if that's you, you still have the same advantages. You still have the same advantages. So that's the advantages. Thirdly and lastly, what in the world is the basis for thinking this way? How in the world can I see the world this way? Well, look with me in verse 25. We're just working our way back. Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. And I'll be honest, when we read these verses, it kind of feels difficult to understand. When I read it, it kind of feels like, oh man, did Paul just have a really bad day, and he's just kind of grumpy or something, I mean, isn't this the same guy that wrote Ephesians chapter 5? This epic vision of marriage and how it relates to Christ's love for the church? Well, yeah, I don't know. Paul, I don't think is having a bad day. At least I don't think. I guess I don't really know if he is or not. But when you read this statement in context here, we see why he's saying all that he's been saying. And what he's saying is giving us this Christian worldview. It's giving us gospel glasses to put on our faces and to see the world through. What does it say in verse 29? What's the basis for viewing life this way, especially singleness? He says what? The appointed time has grown very short. Well, what's the appointed time? The appointed time is the moment when all true believers are really excited for. It's what your heart is just longing for. And that is what? It's for King Jesus to return. It's for him to return. It says the time we have in the here and now is short, and that changes the way that we're going to live in the present. How we see this laid out in verses 29 through 31. Right? Jesus has already come and he's begun to usher in his kingdom in the lives of everybody who turns from their sin and trusts in him as his Lord, as their Lord and Savior. And he says that when that happens, new life, heaven, as it were, begins to break into the here and now, into this exact moment. Light begins to break into the darkness when you receive Jesus as King today. His kingdom is coming. It's come. Right? The Spirit has come into the world. It's taken residence in your life if you know him. Right? If you've trusted in him to save you. And if that's you, then you will experience this new life. Right? Life in his Spirit. Yes, you will experience brokenness at the same time, and you will acutely understand, even in those moments, that things aren't the way that they should be. But one day he will return, and we long for that day, because when he does return, everything is going to be made new. It'll be the way that it should be, you could say. So right now, Christians for centuries have called what we are living in right now as the overlapping of the ages. It's the time when Jesus first came and the time that we await his second coming and the full consummation of his kingdom. That's the time that we're living in right now. And so in this overlap of the ages, Paul is saying, yeah, we do marry. We do get jobs. We do work. We do mourn. We do grieve. We do accumulate wealth. but we do so in light of the future. We do so in light of the future. I mean, he's not literally saying that if you're married, just leave your wife. He's saying let the future define the importance and ultimacy that you put on your marriage today. Right? If you're mourning, right, realize that one day you're not going to be mourning. If you're rejoicing and you don't know Christ, realize one day you're going to be mourning when he returns. Right? He goes through and all these things like when he talks about the goods, those who buy as if they had no goods. He's literally just saying, don't live like today is everything. Live like the day Jesus returns is everything. You belong to him and he's returning for you. So when we fix our eyes on heaven, you guys, we will value things on this earth very differently. Very, very differently. And we see this perfectly in the life of Jesus. I mean, he was the truest one who lived with heaven invading his present. He's the one who lived with his whole perspective being on the other side of that cross, in mind at all times. And he was perfect, and he wasn't even married. But yet he was full of hope, he was full of joy. And do you know why he was never married? Well, because he knew that his death and his resurrection would obtain for him his heavenly bride. Right? A bride of people from every tribe, every tongue, every nation. Right? Jesus really is a husband. He is a groom, right? But he is the husband of his people, the groom of his bride, the church. People from every tribe and tongue and nation. This is why it says in Revelation 19 that we are moving towards a day where we will meet him face to face, and it will be a feast, a wedding feast. It says, let us rejoice and be glad and give God all the glory, for the wedding of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. So do you see what he's saying is the basis for viewing the world this way? Even if you're single or you're not single, this is your foundational worldview. He's saying the age is short. Eternity is very long. The present form of this world is passing away, and a new world will ultimately be created. So nothing now is ultimate. If you don't have a family, don't be too upset. If you do have a family, don't stake all your happiness there. In the future, we will experience the ultimate family. And so now we experience a real foretaste of that now in the midst of God's people, the church. That's why we are called a family, a diverse family, a family of people from every tribe and tongue and nation. And one day, if you know Jesus, you will fully and finally experience an eternal family reunion. But this family reunion will not be awkward, right? It'll be one that you actually want to be at, right? It really actually will be a celebration. Did you see what 1 Corinthians 7 is saying? This is the basis for viewing your singleness as a gift and not as ultimate grief. This is the basis for not making an idol out of your family. It's the basis for not making an idol out of your marriage. The shortness of this overlapping age and the promise of this ultimate wedding and family with Christ forever, this vision, this worldview, it equalizes single life and married life. Because we look into our future, whether we are single or married, and we see that each one of us are going to experience the same God, the same heaven, the same joy, the same fulfillment, and that causes us to perceive and value our current situations differently. So I want to ask you, I want you to really consider this morning. Consider this, please. Has Jesus begun to shape your worldview at a foundational level like this? Has Jesus begun to shape your worldview of how you see your marriage in light of heaven? How you see your kids in light of heaven? How you see your singleness in light of heaven? How you see your sexuality in light of heaven? Has it changed the way you see the world? I mean, do you actually believe that the blood of Jesus makes us as believers a thicker, deeper, eternal family that is thicker than the biological blood of our immediate families? And I'm convinced we have to get this. We have to do better at this. I mean, God has a whole vision for the single life, and if we miss that vision, we really hurt people. We really hurt people. We cause people to believe lies, that they're not whole, that they can't experience intimacy in relationships, that they are lacking, and hopefully one day they'll get married. And in our day and age, with the cultural movement towards affirming homosexuality, affirming gender fluidity, this doctrine of singleness is an essential vision that we must get, or else, quite honestly, we have no real future to hold out to other people who are same-sex attracted, who are struggling with sexuality, who are single and they don't want to be. We just say, oh man, your hope is in getting your desires fulfilled now. And that's not what the Bible teaches. That's not real hope. Not at all. We must not only say that church is a family, but we must begin to act like church is a family. And in order to do that, it's not going to be easy. It'll take sacrifice. As we open up our homes to one another, as we say, yeah, you're my family too. And I think when we begin to do that, that's when you'll start seeing beauty come from ashes. Because people won't be thinking about what they don't have. They'll be thinking, look at what I have. Look at what I have. Jesus was single. Paul was single. If you guys know John Stott, he was single. Sam Alberry, single. Bethany Jenkins, single. I could go on and on, countless incredible Christians throughout the centuries who've lived a joyful and fulfilled single life. And I thought I'd end by just telling you briefly about Amy Carmichael, who's another single person. She's got a great little biography written by a historian named Ian Murray. I'd recommend it to you. It's a fantastic little book on her life. She lived in India. She was probably the most famous single woman missionary to leave the shores of England in the modern missionary period. She wrote 35 books in the course of 50 years, and she was read widely by other people. And she, like so many of her female colleagues, struggled with being single. But during her early missionary service in Japan, she came to terms with that struggle, and she wrote about it. And this is what she said. She said, on this day, many years ago, I went away alone to a cave in the mountain called Arima. I had feelings of fear about the future. That was why I went there, to be alone with God. The devil kept on whispering, it's all right now, but what about afterwards? You're still going to be very lonely. And he painted pictures of loneliness. I can see them still. And I turned to my God in a kind of desperation and said, Lord, what can I do? How can I go on to the end? She's talking about her singleness. And he said, none of them that trust in me shall be desolate. And that word has been with me ever since. She did go on to the end. And she did find this to be true. She became deeply involved in India and children's work. Most specifically, she worked hard in rescuing girls from temple prostitution. She established a home and a school for these children. It became known as the Donover Fellowship. Maybe you've heard of it. This all-consuming ministry of hers became her life, and the staff and the children were her family. She soon became convinced that the single life was the only alternative for those in this fellowship, and this became the basis for what she called the Sisters of the Common Life. Right? So anybody who was a woman who joined this fellowship did so voluntarily, but she had this rule: if you ever get married, you can't be a part of it anymore. Right? And it worked. By 1952, her family of sisters numbered 900 people. 900 people. Here is a woman who saw it, her singleness, as a gift. She focused on those advantages, but more than anything, she lived with a heavenly vision. You guys, singleness is a viable plan A for life. And the reason this is the case is because you belong to Jesus. You belong to him. You are not alone. In the condition in which you were called, he's there with you, and you remain there with him always. And he is coming back. And when he comes back, this life will have felt so short. It'll have all been worth it. We were made for that world that's coming. He will take our ashes, and in that day he will give us beauty. Beauty like you can't even imagine today. Let's all bow our heads as we go into our time of response, as the worship team comes back up. As is our normal, I want to give you a few moments here just to pray quietly, talk to God. What has he been saying to you today? As we've been singing, as we've been praying, as we've been hearing from his word, what's he saying to you today? Respond to him. Maybe you're here this morning and you don't know Jesus, but you really sense God doing something in your life today. I'm telling you today, if you've been wandering from him, you can come home to him. He will receive you with his open arms of grace. If you're here this morning, you've never known Jesus, but you sense God working in your life, you go, I believe he is the Son of God. I believe he is my only hope of salvation. You could pray right now in your seat, and you can give your life to him. You can receive him into your life by simply asking him to forgive you of your sins, to come and take up residence in your life. You can pray right now.